The question is that the bill be now read the second time. The Honourable Member for Nelson.
I can put this awkwardly here, Mr President. Thank you, Mr President. I rise to speak on this bill with pleasure, actually, and to say thank you to the Greens for bringing this bill to the Parliament and ultimately to this chamber for consideration. It's absolutely a step in the right direction, Mr President. It doesn't, however, address all the issues that I think a number of us would have with the Act that was previously passed in its place in 2023, and I'll speak about that a little bit more later, but it certainly takes great strides in addressing some of the very key important parts of that Act and improves it. It's a step in the right direction for democracy, for integrity, and for public confidence in our political system here in this state. And may I just say, actually, Mr President, from the outset that I know many people in our community and in our civil society have been engaged over many years in efforts to institute appropriate political donation disclosure laws in our state. And so I absolutely take this opportunity to thank those people who have participated in a whole range of consultations, who've made submissions, who've presented at hearings, who've advocated to MPs on this issue. All of those people who have been unfailingly committed to building the fidelity of our democracy here. I applaud their efforts, and I'm really pleased that we may have the opportunity now to deliver a definite positive step in the right direction for delivering on those things that they have advocated for a long time. Mr President, I certainly also applaud any and every effort in this place to increase integrity of our political landscape, especially our electoral processes. It's always telling, I think, to note when such efforts are opposed or blocked by people in this place. Certainly it's telling when we say here is what we would regard as a very well-evidenced, well-advised standard of integrity to put in place around political donations and disclosures in this state, and we have a major party saying we don't agree with that. You really have to question what's behind wanting to see less integrity and less transparency and deliver less public confidence in our state. Certainly, personally, I have always had a firm commitment to walking the talk on this, and I know that the member for Hobart mentioned the Greens' policies on these things. I have personal policies on these things as an independent member of this place and have had since I was a candidate for election to begin with, where I don't disclose donations above $1,000 and have always done that publicly on my website if I have received them. They haven't been that many, Mr President, and certainly haven't been any in that vicinity for a number of years now, but at different times I did receive some donations which are all very clearly there, specified on my website. So this is something that I think we could, any of us, have been committed to and doing at any point up until now, but I am very pleased that should this amendment bill pass, we'll all be required to do that. And there'll be no longer any hiding behind excuses, well, we're obeying the law, when the law is really a mockery of transparency and integrity when it's set at, as we have had, set at the federal level for all these years. So, Mr President, this is very much a matter of serving the public interest, I believe, and building public confidence in our electoral system, in our democracy. People, I know, do say when it comes to political donations, people donate in order to expect to get something potentially in return or favourable policy outcomes in return. Often you'll hear expressions like those who pay the piper call the tune and those sorts of things. I think we have to be careful because I think there's different ways to regard political donations. Certainly what we see now, I think, is a lot of very grassroots community donations made to candidates, both party candidates and independent candidates across the political landscape. And they're often quite small in size, and it's an expression from individuals out there in the community in terms of who they would like to support and potentially assist to be elected by providing that financial support. I don't think that's more of a values-based choice, I think, and I don't think those individuals out there making their $20 or their $50 donations are expecting particular political outcomes or policy outcomes for themselves as individuals, but they're expressing their aligned values with the candidates that they're supporting. But then we do have corporate donations as well, Mr. President, and that's where things can get more problematic, the less transparency we have around it. That's where we can, I think, turn our minds to the fact that corporate donations, particularly sizeable corporate donations to parties or to candidates, can look like trying to achieve particular outcomes. And whether that's something as tangible as a particular policy outcome, say a new gambling licensing arrangement that you happen to have written and provided to the government, in fact, for delivery on receipt of support at the 2018 election, or whether that's something less tangible, like just generally better access to the Minister or the Premier. They'll take your calls when you put them through, for example, because of the donation that's been made. So it could be a less tangible return on your investment, but a return nonetheless. It does mean potentially better access. It does mean potentially influence on policy outcomes and decisions. So that's where, again, nothing wrong with making donations with that intent in mind, but that's where we expect as a citizenry, as a voting public, to have visibility around that set at an appropriate level so that voters can decide and the public can decide in an ongoing way what influence may have been brought to bear in different situations and different decision-making scenarios. And that's what it comes down to. You can knock yourselves out, corporate donors out there, make every donation you like, but it must be visible to the people who are voting in, governments of the day, political representatives, because it's voters who have to make informed decisions about their choices for representation. And they are entitled to understand the influence environment that is sitting around major parties, minor parties, independent candidates who are running for election. It's as simple as that. So in this bill, I think it's fairly straightforward, and as the member for Hobart described, they've really stripped it back, I think, in a practical approach to some of the key elements that could be provided with broad agreement and support in this place. And that's a sensible decision. It does mean, I hope, that we can take steps forward today. Certainly reducing the disclosure threshold to $1,000 is absolutely without question, regardless of the government's position, without question, that is a standard, normal, expert-advised level to set the disclosure threshold at. It would be absolutely ridiculous for us to maintain $5,000 as a disclosure threshold when we know that would remain keeping us at about equal worst in the country. Why on earth would we aspire to go from worst in the country to pretty much equal worst still in the country? Absolutely ridiculous. Of course we aspire for more for our democracy, Mr. President. So $1,000 disclosure threshold is entirely normal and appropriate and will be absolutely the right spot to land with this bill, should it pass. And then there's the improving timeliness aspects of this bill. For public disclosure outside of election periods, bringing it back from 6 monthly to monthly. Absolutely reasonable. And in fact, the member for Launceston mentioned, of course, bringing it back to monthly means that we're not going to suddenly be going to an election without the most recent 6th monthly disclosure, then perhaps still in the wind and not known, which would, of course, obviate the need for disclosures and the benefits that we have of seeing disclosures, particularly leading into electoral periods. So monthly, I think, makes sense. I think it's where the community actually would still feel, I think, out there, a level of frustration about that. When you speak to members of the community about things like disclosure of political donations, they are gobsmacked that it isn't something we should have to do in real time, effectively, very immediately. And I think we will end up getting to that sort of place, but I think certainly monthly is a lot better than 6 monthly. I think it's an absolutely spurious argument to say use administrative burden as a reason not to do it. It's a matter of establishing systems in place for people to be able to meet that expectation. It's astonishing to me that the government would, in this place, and again, no reflection on the leader, bringing us the message, but for the government in this place to start having concern for administrative burden and what it might be costing us to report against this Act about political donation disclosures. Astonishing, given that the bill went through here providing members of this place with absolutely no support for administrative burden of reporting against the 2023 legislation. Provided funding to the people in the other place, the members in the other place, for administrative arrangements, none here. Astonishing. Now suddenly it's a concern that there's going to be additional administrative burden, and apparently another bill brought. I wonder if we'll be left off the map of that bill as well, Mr President, or whether actually they'll consider us part of this parliament meeting the same rules and expectations and perhaps requiring assistance to do it. How about, instead of giving those in the other place some extra money to meet their administrative requirements, they just make it fair and make sure it's equitable across both chambers, Mr President?
Nice.
That'd be a good start. And quite frankly, speaking about needing extra public money for an administrative burden that might be brought about by this amendment bill passing is absolutely bizarre to me, Mr President, when the 2023 legislation that went through here provided absolutely obscenely generous public funding for elections to those in the other place, absolutely obscenely generous, and did so in the absence of expenditure caps for elections or donations caps. So essentially that 2023 bill went through this parliament supported by both major parties, delivering themselves in the other place a slush fund of public money to pay for them to run for election with no constraint that would be absolutely standard and expected alongside public funding. And that constraint would either be caps on expenditure in elections and/or caps on donations. But none of those went through. Absolutely obscene, actually. The Tasmanian taxpayer will now be providing that slush fund at the next state election to both major parties, primarily in the other place, to run for election and have an even more unequal playing field than we already had between major parties, minor parties, independents. Absolutely obscene. How dare the government now talk about needing to plunder more public money to meet an incredibly reasonable expectation that disclosures happen on a monthly basis outside electoral periods. Unbelievable, Mr President. Mr President, certainly this bill, should it pass this place, and I really hope and believe that it will be an improvement. But there remain a host of other problematic elements to the laws that were passed here in 2023. And I will absolutely, in whatever time I have in this place, Mr President, be pursuing improvements on those areas as well. And they include, and some of these had been mentioned already by the member for Hobart and others, these include what I just said before, the introduction of expenditure caps and/or donation caps to apply to the other place, particularly in light of the public funding that has been provided. I think we should absolutely moderate the level of public funding that has been provided through the bill that went through in 2023. I think the lack of equitable funding across the two chambers that exists in that bill passed in 2023 and now will come into play from the 1st of July should be addressed and rectified. I think that we still should be aiming for even more real-time disclosure during election periods. It's a 7-day period at the moment during elections. I actually think that's not good enough in the last week leading into an election, Mr President. Voters should not have to go to a polling booth not knowing about donations that have been made in that electoral period. So there's a variety of ways we could potentially address that. We should explore them. We should absolutely have a ban on political donations from certain industries and sectors, as they do in other jurisdictions. It's well accepted. So bans on donations from property developers, from gambling interests, from tobacco interests, among others, are ones to be considered, and I think we should be aiming high there, as other jurisdictions have done. And I also think, as mentioned, I think already, truth in political advertising is something we need to explore and find a way forward on in this state to ensure, again, that we don't have a race to the bottom in our democracy and our electoral landscape, that we actually expect better behaviour and a better standard of campaigning. So, Mr. President, one of the things that I'm very proud of in this place is, just in recent times, in this term of Parliament, the establishment of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, an effort that I have long attempted in this place, and we have successfully now formed that Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, and it is an entirely appropriate place for us into the future to be contemplating various of these improvements and further work to be done on strengthening our electoral rules, on our things like our donation disclosure rules around election time, and we will have an opportunity, and all of us in this place can contemplate referring matters to that committee, but we'll certainly have a chance to further examine these sorts of matters via the JSEM committee. I'm glad that that has been something that has been achieved, and I hope it continues now into the future as a standard part of our healthy political architecture here to deliver integrity and public confidence and ongoing improvements. So, Mr. President, I'll wrap up my contribution on this bill. It's certainly to be congratulated, the Greens are to be congratulated for taking this really practical approach and this positive step to progress the bill, to provide the opportunity for us to make these improvements, to strengthen integrity in this place. As I said, it's always notable and concerning to note those who might stand in the way of that and to question why. I think community expectation is absolutely being delivered by this amendment bill and should be absolutely unanimously supported in this place by anyone who has an interest in improving integrity for Tasmania. So I support the bill.
Thank you.
Question is the bill